Hey, what's up guys, it's BenBonk, and recently I participated in the GMTK Game Jam 2023. If you somehow don't know, this is an annual game jam hosted by Mark from the Game Maker's Toolkit YouTube channel, where contestants must make a game from scratch within 48 hours following a theme announced at the start of the jam. For this jam, I worked with ZZT Bat, who helped with the music, and enough said, let's get into it. It was July 7th, and the day of the jam had finally arrived, so I eagerly waited for the YouTube premiere countdown to tick down for the announcement, and once it did, the theme that was announced was Roles Reversed. And as usual, I thought this was a pretty solid theme. There are tons of different types of roles out there, and a lot of different ways you could go with this theme. So I hopped into Google Docs and started drafting out a few ideas. The first few ideas I really had were switching the roles of the player and the enemy, where you have to play as the enemy and attack the player, but that just felt a bit too obvious. Eventually, after a bit more contemplation, I recalled a few videos I'd seen in the past from a YouTuber named Kitboga. And if you're unfamiliar, Kitboga makes videos where he essentially trolls scammers, wastes their time, and sometimes scams them in a way which is really satisfying to see. And I just couldn't get this idea of a scammer getting scammed out of my brain, as it sounded like a pretty funny concept for the game.
Are you bad? Are you mad? Why are you leaving God?
And it would also fit the theme of the roles being reversed in a way. So I got to drafting out this idea, and my original concept was to make a bunch of different small levels, each of which you would scam a scammer. And while I liked this idea initially, it seemed a bit ambitious for the time frame. So I transitioned my idea to be just one level where the player wants to get revenge on a scammer who scammed his brother by hacking into the scammer's PC. And while I didn't have a total grasp on what I wanted the game to be yet, I thought this idea sounded promising, so I started getting set up. And by getting set up, I mean I got straight into making art for the game. I found this really nice neon night sky palette on LostBek that I settled on using for the game. And while I still didn't have a huge plan for the game so far, I knew I needed art for the computer desktop, so I created this sprite, which I think turned out great. And something that computers also need are file windows. I remembered that I had this file window already made for my game Slimekeep, so I just nabbed that, recolored to fit with the palette, and now we had this window which would fit kind of perfectly to the size of the desktop. And speaking of the desktop, all desktops need programs, so I created a few basic program icons such as the settings menu, a web browser, which I also stole from Slimekeep, and a file explorer. Now with some of the base art made to give me an idea for the game, I set up a new Unity project. Then I just started adding all this art that I made and ended up with this. However, the player couldn't actually click on these icons. So I did a bit of coding to allow for this by just making a simple browser script, for example, which would scale up an associated window using tweening to make it look nice. And this code worked, but I decided it would be smart to move away from having to copy all this code again for each individual program, so I made a general program script with this functionality. And specific programs such as the browser, for example, could inherit from this base script if needed. Now, this was a great start, but I also wanted to make functionality for smaller windows in which the player could move around the screen. So I ended up working on this movable window script to allow for this, and with the help of a tutorial, I ended up with this script, which was surprisingly way more simple than I thought it would be. And now in game, the player could drag these windows all across the screen and drop them wherever they like. However, there was just one slight problem. If the player wanted to, they could completely drag these windows off screen and have them lost forever. So to fix this, I added in this function which was called whenever the player dropped a window. And this would just check if the window is outside of a set boundary, which I could set in the inspector, and if so, it would return the window to the center of the screen. Now, originally I had these boundaries set to the actual desktop area on the computer, but that just felt really limiting and awkward, so I extended it to be pretty much the whole game screen. Next up, I want to give the player the option to be able to close their program by clicking on the actual app icon again once it was open. So to do this, I refactored the program script a bit to combine the open and close function into this one big function. Now with this basic computer setup done, it was time for me to actually figure out what this game was going to be and how it would work. I just ended up making a list of programs that I needed for the computer, as well as basically draft out the whole sequence of events on how the player would actually win the game by shutting down the scammer's bank account. But I won't really show you that now as to not spoil the game. Anyways, I got to work on a few of the new program icons, such as the trash bin, a program that the scammer uses to remotely connect to victims' PCs, a virtual phone program for calling victims, and finally, a simple text messaging program. Now, I wanted to actually work on the art for the unique windows that would pop up once the player opened each of these programs. My goal was to make each of these windows at least somewhat unique from the rest and visually appealing. So after a few hours, I ended up with a bunch of new custom windows. We have the files window, the email window, the bank window, the settings window, and so on. And yeah, I'm really happy with how these windows turned out, as I think they look pretty aesthetically pleasing. Then I just set all of them up in game, and boom, things were really starting to come together. Now it was time to actually set up these windows with text and functionality so the game would actually work. So for the next few hours, I basically just set up a ton of UI. This was a bit of a weird feeling, as typically in games I make, most of my time is spent programming, but in this case, most of my time was really just spent adding text and text fields all over the game's windows. But eventually, I made some really nice progress just setting up this UI. However, I did notice a slight issue with the draggable windows, as sometimes they would pop up under each other or drag in the wrong layer order. So to fix this, I made a simple draggable manager script, which would simply set the current window that the player is dragging to be above all the other windows. Anyways, with that hiccup out of the way, I got back to actually setting up the game. For example, I gave the files window functionality to open up all these individual files, some of which were for fun and backstory, and some of which were needed for the game's puzzles. And now for the next 2 hours, I don't really have too much to show you. I basically just spent this time setting up the actual functionality for each window and making things interactable. This took loads of time as I was really setting up the actual game look and putting things together piece by piece, but I can't really show you too much as to not spoil some of the game's puzzles. But with that whole ordeal done, now all the game's windows were pretty much set up. For example, you can read the scammer's messages in the chat program, attempt to log into the phone program, read the scammer's emails, and so on. I wish I could show you more on how some of the puzzles and deductions work, but I really encourage you to play the game as it's probably one of my most proud Game Jam games I've ever made. Anyways, now that the game part was kind of done, I moved on to creating a very simple start screen and adding a backstory to the game, as right now, the game really didn't make much sense or follow the theme if there wasn't a backstory to explain. I hopped into Aseprite and drew a few basic sprites to help with the storytelling, and now we had an actual backstory for the game, where this guy named Ronald tries to get revenge on a scammer who scammed his brother for his life savings by hacking into the scammer's PC. Next, I added sound effects to the game, and what I mean by this is I added one sound effect for when the player opens or closes a program. But on the topic of audio, ZZTbat had finished making the music for the game, so I set that up in the game as well. He made 2 tracks for the game, one for the start screen / cutscene, which sounded like this, and one for the main game area, which sounded like this. I honestly think ZZTbat killed it with the music and really nailed the hacker vibe of the game, so huge thanks to him for helping with the music. But anyways, by now the game was pretty much done, so I built it out to WebGL, but of course it didn't end up loading, so I had to go back and change the compression type. And now we're good. Well, not really, because the game was super laggy in the web version for some reason. But it seemed to work fine in browsers besides Chrome, so I was pretty confused and just left this on the back burner for now. Instead, I worked on the cover art for the game and set up the itch.io page. And by this point, we still had around 3 hours left till the jam ended, so I took this time to have a few people playtest the game, notably Amster and ZZTbat, who gave some really good feedback for a few of the puzzles, so huge thanks to them. They also suggested a few smaller things, such as making it more clear that you're on the scammer's PC, so I added this little text blurb to the top right, and their feedback also prompted me to add a hints menu to the game just in case the player gets stuck. But with that said, the game was now basically done. I submitted to the jam with plenty of time to spare, although it still was quite laggy on Chrome, so I don't know if that's just me, but I made a desktop build just in case. Anyways, that is my entry to the GMTK Game Jam 2023. Sorry if I was a bit vague, as I didn't want to spoil too much, but I hope you enjoyed this video, and I really encourage you to give the game a try if you haven't already, as I'm super proud of it. Overall, this was an interesting game jam experience for me, as the development of this game really didn't have any major hiccups or issues at all, and for once, I think I had a fairly smooth ride with just a lot of UI work. Also, it's funny to think that this game I ended up making is actually rather similar to my initial plan for an old scrapped game of mine called Hacker Game, which I made a few devlogs about many years ago. But I ended up quitting that project partially due to me not being the best programmer at that time, as I was having issues creating simple systems such as opening and dragging windows, which I was able to breeze by here. So in a way, I think this game almost represents my progress as a game developer over the years, all coming full circle, which I think is kind of cool. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.